So just following on from our previous video then, quite a short one this one, just on aggregate demand and how we deal with the components in terms of shifts. So what we said in the previous video, if we remember, is that in our macro diagram we have our price level and our real output, or real GDP, that might be labelled as. And then we have our aggregate demand curve sloping downwards like this. Now, the previous video went through the three reasons why aggregate demand slopes downwards. So that's the effects outlined by Pigou and Keynes, and also the exchange rate effect. So that's why aggregate demand slopes downwards. If you're not sure about that, then you can watch the previous video. If we remember, we also saw in a previous video that aggregate demand is made up of these three different components, and what we can say then is if we see any change in any of these components which aren't caused by a change in price, then what we will see is that we will actually have a shift in aggregate demand and the whole line will move. So we're going to look at each of these components separately, but let's say, for instance, that there was an increase in income levels within the economy. That's going to increase the level of consumption, because households will have more money to spend, and what that will do is that will move AD to the right. So if this was AD1, this will be AD2, and we will see a movement to the right in aggregate demand. And what this tells us is that even though prices have remained the same, what is happening now is that we have a higher level of real output now. We have a higher level of activity within the economy because of this increase in income. So if we have a change in any of these factors which isn't the price, then the aggregate demand curve shifts. Now, the way to think about aggregate demand then is to make sure that whenever you talk about aggregate demand in an exam, you don't just talk about it as changing by itself. Aggregate demand can't change by itself. It can only change when one of the factors, one of the components which make up aggregate demand, change. So aggregate demand can only change if one or more of C, G, I, and X minus M altogether change. Now, what we will see in the next little series of videos, the first one will be consumption, is that there are a number of factors then which will influence the level of consumption. I'm not going to go through them in detail here, but there are 5 of them. So what we've got then is we've got these factors which are going to influence the level of consumption. And the key to building up good macro analysis in your economics answers is to think about how the factors affect the component and then how the component affects aggregate demand. And then the next stage, once we've done all of this, is then to think about how aggregate demand and aggregate supply work together. But it's all about building up these individual stages, these individual connections. So a factor influences the component influences aggregate demand. In the example we just saw, there was an increase in income, disposable income, that was the factor. That leads to an increase in C. The increase in C leads to an increase in aggregate demand, which is what we see here by the aggregate demand curve shifting to the right. So that's how these things set themselves up, just as a bit of an introduction to the next little series of videos and a link from what we've already looked at to where we are going.